Good. Well, so you've got, I think, mostly by word of mouth, a full first year Latin apprenticeship up and running. I assume it's going well.
Yep.
You and I haven't talked about it in a while, but I'm of course fascinated. I don't know any Latin. That's painfully obvious anytime I try and speak it to someone. But uh, I see the necessity at a number of levels for why we want Latin to continue in good education. Very few of which are what I would call practical reasons. Most of them are quite liberal reasons. Talk to me just a little bit. Well, I guess I have a two-part question. What is this kind of a, and I keep wanting to refer to it as immersionist, or what does a classroom that's taught from within the language practically look like? What's the experience like for the student? And then justify it. Why is it, in your mind, better than the grammar translation model that's probably the majority of what you would find in a Latin class today?
Yeah, and I'll just kind of work back a little bit quickly and then go back forward. I At one time I might have said better. I don't know if I'm so comfortable with saying that. I am very comfortable saying that's different, and I think that there is a place or a rationale for teaching a grammar translation approach, and there are three. Historically, there are three reasons for learning a language: literary, scholarly, and social. And there's a whole tradition, a historical tradition of teaching languages that, depending on which one of those three areas of language learning, I think there's an appropriate model of instruction associated with that goal. So if the goal was social, to learn a language, then that makes less sense to focus purely on grammar and translation than it does to learn the language by means of using it, by hearing it, by speaking it, by reading it, writing it. Those are the four language faculties I was referring to earlier: reading, writing, speaking, listening. But if your aim is scholarly, then it makes perfect sense to use a grammar translation approach to learn the syntactical structures and fundamental grammar of a language, because it's going to serve a purpose for which you're studying the language. So it just kind of depends, like, why are you studying a language, and what mode of instruction is most fitting to that purpose. So that's kind of how I look at it now. But I use something that's called, some people call it the direct method. That's kind of what it was historically known as. It originated in some sense out of the 19th century. W.H.D. Rouse was one of the first proponents of it then. However, that's what it was sort of called at the time, though teaching the language by means of the language goes all the way back to the classical period. And so there's a full-on historical trajectory in line of a consistent line of teaching the language in this way. And in fact, it's only after the Enlightenment, that mid-18th century going into the 19th and 20th centuries, that the scholarly languages, Latin and Greek, became focused and taught purely from a grammar translation approach. That's more of a modern form of teaching, as opposed to a more classical form or historic form. So in my classroom, what it looks like is we have a text. We use a book by Hans Orberg called Lingua Latina. There are two books, Familia Romana and Roma Eterna. And the students in the school, if they continue with their Latin up into the high school and complete the required credits, they'll get through the first book, and they might get into the second book a little bit. If they want to continue their Latin into their junior and senior year, we'll get further into more actual Latin texts. Like, I have a group of students right now, we're reading Caesar and Virgil this year. But the students come in, and basically I teach it. I try to use, what we've learned in the apprenticeship. mimetic instruction, the mimetic mode of instruction, and which I'll say basically is teaching a single idea by means of types. And the point is you want the student to be able to see the idea by looking first at the types, because an idea is abstract, and which is a very hard thing to see. But when we learn something, we first learn something by seeing it through our senses, by means of our senses. And so we need to be able to see something. We need to be able to hear something. We need to be able to touch, smell, right? We need to be able to engage the idea by means of our senses. And so we use types. We use, sometimes you might say, example. And by means of those types, the student slowly and gradually begins to see what the idea is. And the goal is for the student to move from perception to imitation and recreation. So the student begins to imitate the idea, but ultimately you want the student to be able to represent the idea themselves by having fully grasped it.